December 25th, 1989. A cold winter morning in Romania. The wind was sharp, the air heavy, and inside a small military base in Targovist, a man who once ruled 20 million people was about to face the end. Nicolae Ceaușescu, the self-proclaimed genius of the Carpathians, was about to learn that dictators rarely die peacefully. He stood there with his wife, Elena, both wrapped in worn coats, surrounded by soldiers who once swore loyalty to them. Minutes later, the sound of gunfire would echo through the courtyard, and the reign of fear that lasted more than 2 decades would collapse with it. But how did Romania's most powerful man end up here, tied to a post, condemned by his own people? Let's go back. Nicolae Ceaușescu wasn't born into power. He came from a small village, poor, restless, full of ambition. As a teenager, he joined the communist movement, was arrested several times, and dreamed of changing Romania forever. He got his wish, just not the way he imagined. After World War II, the communists seized control. Ceaușescu climbed the ladder fast, a loyal soldier of the party, a man who knew how to flatter superiors and crush rivals. When the old leader, George Dage, died in 1965, Nicolae stepped in quietly and never stepped out again. At first, he was admired, even in the West. He stood up to Moscow, refused to join Soviet invasions, and spoke of Romanian independence. Foreign leaders smiled, shook his hand, and invited him to visit. He met Nixon, Queen Elizabeth, and countless others who saw him as a different kind of communist. But behind that smile, he was building something darker. The 1970s began with hope, new factories, new housing, grand speeches about a golden age. Ceaușescu promised to make Romania strong and debt-free. But his dream came with a price. He borrowed billions from foreign banks to industrialize the country. And when the debt grew, he decided the people would pay it back, literally. He ordered massive exports of food and oil, leaving his own citizens hungry. Shops emptied. Electricity was cut off. People stood in lines for hours just to get bread or milk. By the 1980s, Romania was living in darkness, sometimes quite literally. Cold apartments, no heat, no light, no meat. And yet, on television, Ceaușescu was always smiling, waving to cheering crowds that had been ordered to cheer. He built palaces while his people starved. He filled streets with giant portraits of himself and Elena, the mother of the nation. Together, they ruled like a royal couple in a country that had no kings left. To keep control, Ceaușescu unleashed the Securitate, one of the most feared secret police forces in Eastern Europe. They listened to phone calls, opened letters, turned neighbors into informants. No one could trust anyone. A single joke could land you in prison. Even children in schools learned to praise Comrade Ceaușescu. His birthday became a national holiday. People rehearsed applause, practiced smiles. Fear wasn't an emotion anymore. It was a way of life. And the man at the top truly believed he was loved. He had isolated himself so completely that he thought the entire country still adored him. But outside the walls of his palace, the anger was growing, quietly, dangerously, inevitably. It all began with a small protest in the western city of Timișoara. The government wanted to evict a local priest, Laszlo Tokes, for criticizing the regime. People gathered to protect him. They shouted, they sang, they refused to move. At first, the authorities laughed it off. But then, the crowd grew. Hundreds turned into thousands. Police were ordered to break it up, tear gas, water cannons, and then bullets. Dozens were killed. Bodies were taken away in trucks during the night. But by then, it was too late. The truth spread. The revolution had begun. Ceaușescu returned to Bucharest furious. He wanted to prove that he was still in control. So he organized a massive rally. 100,000 people gathered in front of the communist headquarters to hear their leader speak. It was supposed to be a show of strength. Instead, it was his downfall. Cameras were rolling. Ceaușescu began his usual speech about peace, unity, the great achievements of socialism. But suddenly, from somewhere in the crowd, came a sound he had never heard before. Boos, then shouting, then chaos. He froze. His face went pale. For a moment, you can see on the footage that look of pure confusion. The illusion shattered right there in front of the whole nation. The crowd erupted. People screamed, "Down with the dictator!" The army began to hesitate, and Ceaușescu, for the first time in decades, was terrified. Within hours, the protest had spread everywhere. Fighting broke out in the streets. Armored vehicles burned, soldiers defected, and the once mighty Communist Party began to collapse. On December 22nd, Ceaușescu and Elena fled the capital by helicopter. It was chaos, gunfire below, smoke rising from the buildings, protesters storming the party headquarters. He escaped, but not for long. They landed outside Bucharest, tried to find help, but nobody wanted to shelter them. Even their most loyal officers began to disappear. Eventually, local police captured them and handed them over to the army. The once feared dictator and his wife were now prisoners, sitting in a small, freezing room, waiting to hear their fate. December 25th, 1989. The trial, if you could even call it that, took place inside a small room at the Targovist military base. It lasted less than an hour. The judges read out the charges: genocide, abuse of power, destruction of the economy, ordering soldiers to fire on civilians. Ceaușescu refused to recognize the court. He shouted that he was still president, that this was all illegal. Elena screamed at the soldiers, cursed the judges, called them traitors. The room was boiling with tension. The officers were angry, impatient. Everyone knew how this would end. When a verdict came, death by firing squad, no one was surprised. Minutes later, they were led outside into the cold. Soldiers tied their hands behind their backs and lined them up against a wall. A cameraman tried to film everything, but even he could barely keep up with how fast it happened. Nicolae looked calm, almost defiant. He shouted, "Long live the Socialist Republic of Romania!" Elena refused to stand still. She kicked, she screamed, she cursed. And then the command was given. A burst of gunfire tore through the air. Dozens of bullets. It was over in seconds. The camera shook, soldiers shouted, smoke filled the yard. When it cleared, both bodies lay motionless on the ground. The revolution had taken its revenge. Their corpses were later shown on television, a grim message to the country. The Ceaușescus are gone. The nightmare is over. But ending a dictatorship doesn't end the scars it leaves behind. Romania was free, yes, but it was also broken, confused, unsure what came next. More than 1,000 people had died in the fighting. Many more were wounded. The new leaders promised democracy, but the old habits of fear and corruption took years to fade. For some, the execution felt like justice. For others, it was a rush to revenge, a moment too fast, too raw, too chaotic to ever be called fair. Even today, Romanians argue about that day. Was it justice, or just another tragedy? Was it a new beginning, or the violent end of an old illusion? What happened to Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu wasn't just the fall of a regime, it was the breaking of a spell built on fear, lies, and hunger. For decades, people whispered. On that Christmas day, they finally shouted. In the end, the dictator who demanded absolute loyalty died in front of soldiers who no longer believed in him. And maybe that's the truest symbol of tyranny. It always ends surrounded by silence or by gunfire. History has a way of catching up, even when it walks slowly. And on that cold December afternoon in 1989, it finally caught up with Nicolae Ceaușescu.